The cold did not ask permission before it entered. It slipped through the cracked timber of the widow's cottage like a thief, curling around my ankles, climbing the hem of my worn linen skirt, pressing itself against the back of my neck, until every breath I exhaled became a small ghost dissolving into the air. Winter had arrived 3 weeks ahead of the harvest moon, and the village of Ashenvale had not been ready. Neither had I. I stood at the hearth stirring a pot of barley broth so thin it was nearly a lie. 2 small ceramic bowls waited on the table behind me, chipped at the rims, worn smooth by years of use. The fire beneath the pot struggled. I had used the last of the dry wood that morning, and what remained in the pile outside was half buried under a fresh fall of snow that had arrived while I slept. Or rather, while I had lain awake pretending to sleep, staring at the ceiling beams and doing the kind of arithmetic that kept widows alive through hard months. How many days of grain remained? How many coins in the clay pot beneath the floorboard? How many ways a woman alone with 2 small children could make nothing stretch into enough? The answer was always the same. Not many. Mama. A small voice from the doorway to the sleeping room. Little Pip, 6 years of age, stood bundled in the blanket I had wrapped around him before dawn, his dark hair sticking up at odd angles, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He looked so much like his father that some mornings the sight of him pressed against the inside of my chest like a bruise. "Go back to sleep," I said softly. "The broth is not ready." "Rosie is cold." I closed my eyes briefly. Rosie was 4. She ran warmer than Pip in summer, but seemed to have no reserves against a winter like this one. I crossed the room, crouched at his level, pressed my palm to his forehead. He was not feverish, only chilled. "Come here, both of you," I said, and he disappeared back through the doorway. I followed, pulled Rosie from the straw mattress. She was already awake, clutching the wool rabbit I had sewn for her last winter from scraps, and carried her to the main room, settling both children near what warmth the hearth still offered. Then I went back to the pot. My name is Hazel, and I had been a widow for 14 months. My husband Cedric had been a wheelwright, a decent man. Not a man of great passions or grand speeches, but steady, solid, the kind of man who remembered to check the thatch before every rain, and who always saved the last of the honey for the children. He had gone with a fever that came fast and without mercy in the autumn of the previous year, and when he left, he took with him the only thing standing between me and the village's particular kind of cruelty: a man's name attached to mine. Without it, I was simply the widow, the one who took the drafty cottage at the edge of the village green, because it was the only one no one else wanted. The one the other women watched carefully when their husbands walked past. The one the miller charged a little more than he should have, because he understood, as everyone in Ashenvale seemed to, that I had nowhere else to go. Ashenvale was a small village in the outer territories of the kingdom of Vornholt, and Vornholt was ruled by the Alpha King. Most people in the outer villages spoke of the Alpha King the way they spoke of distant weather, a force that existed, that shaped things, but that had nothing to do with daily life. His name was Dominic. I had heard it whispered in the market square, when traders came through, always in the same tone. Respectful, a little afraid. They said he was not old, perhaps 30 years, perhaps a few more, and that he ruled with the kind of authority that needed no cruelty to reinforce it. The cruelty reinforced itself simply by his existing. I knew nothing of kings. I knew broth and firewood, and the sound my children made in their sleep. The morning I first understood that winter had become truly dangerous, not inconvenient, not difficult, but dangerous, was the morning I counted the grain and found 4 days left. Perhaps 5 if I kept the portions small. Small enough that Pip had already stopped asking for seconds without being told not to, which meant he already understood, in the way children quietly understand things that no one has explained to them, that something was wrong. That was the morning I wrapped my heaviest shawl around my shoulders, put the children with old Marta next door, a widow herself, ancient and toothless but kind, who took them in for small errands in return, and walked to the market square to see what could be done. What could be done, it turned out, was very little. The miller had no credit to extend to me. The baker looked at me with something close to pity and offered a half loaf at full price, which I paid for with coins I should not have spent. The village headman, a broad man called Aldrich, who smelled of tallow and self-importance, informed me that the winter grain stores were being rationed and that allocation was determined by household size relative to contribution. Widows with young children who were not producing for the village, not farming, not crafting, not contributing to the communal tithe, were low priority. He said this without looking directly at me. I thanked him and left before he could see that my hands were shaking. On the walk home, I passed the center well, where a group of women were gathered despite the cold, speaking in low voices with the particular energy of people who have news. I slowed. In Ashenvale, news traveled in clusters at the well, and usually it was the kind of news that eventually touched everyone. Stopped at the Thornfield crossroads last night, one of them was saying, a woman named Greta, whose husband ran the tannery. 6 horses, maybe more. Royal colors. Royal? Another woman, younger, her eyes wide. Here? Why? Not here. The king's hunting party passes through the outer territories in winter. You know that. But they say this year he's not just passing. They say... Greta lowered her voice, and I found myself standing very still. They say the king's company has made camp in the Thornfield clearing. 3 days' ride from here, no more. His steward rode ahead to the nearest villages, seeking provisions, and servants. Servants, someone repeated. Temporary, for the duration of the winter camp. He pays in silver, they say. Real silver, not scrip. The group went quiet for a moment. In the silence, I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite hope. Not yet. Something smaller than hope, but in the same family. The distant cousin of hope. I walked home faster than I had walked anywhere in months. That night, after I put the children to sleep and sat beside the dying fire, I let myself think about it properly. A winter camp. A king's steward seeking servants. Silver coin. I was not without skills. I had kept this cottage for 3 years. I could cook, clean, manage a household fire for warmth, tend to linens, carry water, manage provisions. These were not glamorous abilities, but they were real ones. The problem was this: a 3-day ride in this weather, with no mount and 2 small children. I turned the problem over in my mind the way you turn a stone, looking for a soft side. In the morning, old Marta agreed to keep Pip and Rosie for as long as necessary. She asked for nothing but a share of whatever I earned, a fair arrangement, and the only kind I could afford. I packed what I needed into a single cloth sack. A change of linen, the small clay pot with what remained of my coins, the half loaf of bread, a wedge of hard cheese. I left before the sun was fully up. The road east toward Thornfield was empty in the early hours, the snow unmarked by cartwheels or hoof prints, and I walked with my shawl pulled tight and my breath coming in small white bursts. My boots were not good boots. The left sole had been repaired twice, and would not survive another winter at this rate. But they held. I had been walking for perhaps 2 hours, well past the last farmhouses at the edge of Ashenvale's territory, when I heard it. A sound. Small. Distressed. Coming from the ditch along the left side of the road, half hidden under a shelf of wind-blown snow. I stopped. A whimper. Then another. I knelt beside the ditch and pushed aside the snow with my bare hands. Beneath it, curled together so tightly they formed a single mass of gray and tawny fur, were 3 wolf pups, very young, still soft-eared, their eyes barely open. They were shaking so hard I could feel the vibration when I touched them. Alive, but not by much. I looked up and down the empty road. No sign of their mother. No tracks in the snow except the ones already being filled by the wind. I looked back at the pups. I should have kept walking. I had barely enough for myself. I had children waiting at home. Instead, I opened my cloth sack, unwrapped the cheese from its linen cloth, and tucked all 3 pups inside against my chest, wrapping the sack over them to hold in warmth. Then I stood, adjusted the weight, and kept walking east. I told myself it was a small thing. I did not yet know that those 3 shivering creatures pressed against my ribs were the hinge upon which my entire life was about to turn. The Thornfield camp was nothing like what I had imagined. I had pictured something modest, a cluster of tents, a few fires, the kind of temporary arrangement a hunting party might assemble in the field. What I found when I crested the last ridge and looked down into the wide clearing was something closer to a small fortress made of canvas and timber and absolute authority. There were at least 30 tents arranged in a deliberate pattern, the largest at the center flying a banner I recognized even from a distance. The black wolf on deep crimson that was the seal of the royal house of Vornholt. Around the central tent, smaller ones fanned outward in concentric rings. Between them, pathways had been stamped through the snow by dozens of boots, creating a kind of temporary village. Fires burned at regular intervals, tended by servants I could see even from the ridge. Horses were stabled in a makeshift enclosure of rope and timber posts. Guards walked the perimeter in pairs, their armor catching the flat winter light. I stood at the top of the ridge for a moment longer than I should have. The pups had settled against my chest during the long walk, warmed by my body heat and by each other. One of them, the smallest, the tawny one, had stopped shaking about an hour into the walk, which had frightened me badly until I felt its tiny heartbeat still steady beneath my palm. They stirred occasionally and made small sounds, but they had not cried loudly. Somehow they seemed to understand, the way very young creatures sometimes do, that silence was safer. I adjusted the sack, squared my shoulders, and walked down the ridge toward the camp. The guard who stopped me at the perimeter was large, broad-shouldered, with the flat, assessing stare of a man who has spent years deciding in 3 seconds whether things are a threat. He looked at me, a thin woman in a worn shawl with a cloth sack clutched to her chest, and the stare softened slightly into something closer to dismissal. "Business?" he said. "I've come about the servant positions," I said. "I heard the steward was seeking staff. I have experience keeping a household. Cooking, cleaning, fire management, provision handling." He looked at me for another moment, then jerked his head toward a smaller tent near the eastern edge of the camp. "Steward's tent. Tell them Bren sent you." I nodded and walked in the direction he indicated. The steward's tent was warmer than anything I had experienced in weeks, heated by a small iron brazier that glowed with well-tended coals. The steward himself was a precise, gray-haired man named Aldous, who sat behind a folding table covered in neat stacks of parchment and looked at me over the tops of them with the polite efficiency of someone who had already interviewed 20 people that morning. He asked about my experience. I told him. He asked if I was bonded to any lord. I said no. I was a free woman from Ashenvale, a widow. He wrote something down. Then he looked up at my sack. The smallest pup had chosen that precise moment to make a sound. Not loud, not sharp, just a thin, wavering whimper that seemed to fill the small tent with startling clarity. Aldous set down his quill. "What," he said carefully, "is in your bag?" There was no point in anything but honesty. I opened the top of the sack and showed him the 3 pups, still nested in the linen cloth, blinking in the sudden light. The expression that crossed Aldous's face was not one I had expected. He stood slowly, came around the table, and looked at the pups with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to 3 small animals. His face had gone still, in a way that reminded me of water going smooth before a storm. "Where did you find these?" he said, very quietly. "In a ditch on the Thornfield Road," I said. "About 4 hours' walk west of here. They were buried in the snow. Their mother, I don't know. There were no tracks. How long have you had them?" "Since mid-morning. I've kept them warm against my chest. The smallest one gave me a scare early on, but it seems to have steadied." Aldous straightened. He looked at me for a long moment with an expression I could not fully read, something between assessment and something rawer than that. "Stay here," he said. He left the tent. I stood and waited, swaying slightly from the warmth after so many hours in the cold. My feet ached, my arms ached from holding the sack close. But the brazier's heat was extraordinary, and I stayed very still and let it work its way into my bones, not wanting to move and break whatever was happening. He was gone for perhaps 10 minutes. When the tent flap opened again, it was not Aldous who entered first. The man who came through the opening had to dip his head slightly for the clearance. He straightened inside the tent, and the space, which had seemed comfortably sized a moment ago, immediately felt different. Not smaller, exactly. Recalibrated, as if the room had rearranged its understanding of what center meant. He was dark-haired, with the kind of strong-boned face that is not precisely handsome but is impossible to stop looking at. His eyes were a dark, wolfish amber, and they went directly to the sack at my chest with an expression I had no name for. Something between pain and ferocity and something else, something more carefully controlled than either. He was wearing a riding coat, dark wool, no ceremonial armor, no crown, nothing to mark him except the way every other person in the tent. Aldous had followed him in, along with 2 guards, had arranged themselves relative to him, slightly back, slightly angled, the way iron filings arrange themselves around a lodestone. I knew who he was without being told. I did the appropriate thing. I dropped to one knee, clutching the sack carefully to keep it steady. Rise. The voice was low. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to fill a space. I stood. I kept my eyes at a respectful level, which meant looking roughly at the center of his chest. "Look at me," he said. I looked up. He was studying my face with that same careful, unreadable intensity. Then his gaze dropped to the sack. "May I?" he said. Not a question exactly. More a form of courtesy applied to something he had already decided. I opened the top of the sack and held it toward him. He reached in with both hands. Large hands, scarred across the knuckles in the particular way of men who have trained with weapons since childhood, and lifted all 3 pups out with a gentleness that was startling. He held them against his chest, and something in his face shifted. The controlled expression cracked, just slightly, at the edges. He stood there for a long moment, holding 3 shivering wolf pups against the front of his riding coat, and said nothing. "They're mine," he said finally. The words came out quiet and rough. "My breeding pair, they were. The female was due in another week. She went missing 2 nights ago during the storm. We searched." He stopped. Something moved across his face, quickly suppressed. "We didn't find her." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. Sometimes silence is the most respectful thing available. He looked down at the pups, then back up at me. "You walked from where you found them," he said. It wasn't a question. Aldous had clearly told him. "Yes, my lord. In this cold, carrying them the entire way. There was no other option, my lord. They would not have survived." Something shifted in his expression again. He looked at me with that assessing amber gaze, and this time it was different. Not the assessment of a king cataloging a servant, but something more personal than that. More direct. "What is your name?" he said. "Hazel, my lord. Of Ashenvale." "Hazel of Ashenvale." He repeated it as if setting it somewhere specific in his memory. "You came seeking work." "Yes, my lord." "You have children." Again, Aldous. The steward was thorough. "2, my lord. Left in the village with a neighbor. I needed the work to..." I stopped myself. A king did not need the accounting of my grain supply. "The winter is difficult." He was quiet for a moment. The pups had settled against him the way they had settled against me, trusting warmth, trusting size, trusting the nearness of something alive. "You fed my pups," he said. Something in the way he said it was deliberate, careful, as if the words meant more than their surface. "I gave them what little warmth I had," I said. "I didn't have food small enough for them. You kept them alive." He looked at me steadily, "with your body heat. For 4 hours in the cold. Yes, my lord. The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. It had weight to it. The 2 guards near the tent entrance had gone very still. Aldous was looking at a spot on the canvas wall with the specific focus of a man trying hard not to appear to be listening. The Alpha King looked at me for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was even and quiet, but each word had a particular precision. "Feed my pups," he said slowly, "and I will claim you." The words landed in the silence of the tent like a stone dropped into still water, and I felt the ripples of them reach every edge of the room before I fully understood what I had heard. I stared at him. He held my gaze without flinching, without any sign that he had said something extraordinary, except for the faintest tension in the line of his jaw that suggested he was waiting, carefully, deliberately waiting, for my response. My heart was doing something irregular inside my chest. My mind was doing its arithmetic again, but the numbers were entirely different from this morning's. "My lord," I said carefully, "I am not certain I understand." "I think you do," he said. And the terrible thing, the thing that would keep me awake for a long time afterward, staring at unfamiliar tent canvas in the dark, was that he was right. I did understand. I did not sleep that first night in the Thornfield camp. They gave me a tent. Small, near the eastern edge, shared with 2 other women who had come from nearby villages to work as laundresses and kitchen help. Both of them were asleep within minutes of lying down, accustomed to hard work and harder beds. I lay on my cot with my eyes open and listened to the wind push against the canvas walls and tried to organize my thoughts into something manageable. The Alpha King had said those words. Plainly, without ceremony, without the kind of elaborate courtly language I might have expected from a man of his position. "Feed my pups, and I will claim you." Then, before I could fully react, he had handed the 3 pups to a waiting attendant with precise instructions about their warmth and feeding, watered goat's milk every 2 hours, kept near the fire but not too close, and turned to Aldous. "Give her the senior household position, full wage, beginning today. See that she has what she needs." And then he had left the tent. Aldous had looked at me with an expression that was carefully professional but contained, underneath its surface a kind of respectful bewilderment. He had led me to the supply tent, issued me a better shawl, heavier boots 1 size too large that I would need to stuff with linen, and explained my duties, managing the provision stores for the inner camp, coordinating meals for the king's personal household, overseeing the linens and the fire maintenance in the central tents. It was more responsibility than I had expected. It was also, I realized, a position that placed me closer to the center of the camp than most. I had not yet decided how I felt about that. Claim you. In the language of the Alpha Kingdom, those words had a specific meaning that everyone who grew up within its borders understood. An Alpha King did not claim a woman the way a man bought a horse or acquired land. It was older than that, deeper than that. A formal recognition, a bond. It meant protection. It meant standing. It meant that whatever I had been before, a widow, a woman alone, a person the miller could overcharge without consequence, I would not be afterward. It also meant something I was less prepared to examine, that he had looked at me, a thin woman in worn boots, with a cloth sack full of borrowed warmth, and decided something. In the morning, my duties began before the light was fully up. The provision stores were housed in 2 large tents connected by a covered passage, and they were, I discovered, in a state of organized chaos. The previous woman responsible had left suddenly. Illness, Aldous told me, without elaborating. And the 3 days since had accumulated small disorder everywhere. Inventory lists that didn't match actual stock. Grain sacks stacked incorrectly. The heavier ones on top in a way that would damage the ones beneath. Salt wrapped in cloth that had begun to absorb moisture. I spent the first 3 hours simply assessing, making lists on the small square of parchment Aldous had given me, counting, tasting, smelling. By mid-morning I had a clear picture of what needed doing and had begun to do it. I was reorganizing the salt stores when I became aware that I was being watched. I turned. Standing in the entrance to the provision tent was a young man, perhaps 19, with the broad shoulders and attentive posture of someone recently assigned to an important post. He had dark eyes and an open, honest face that reminded me faintly of Pip, though he was years older. He was wearing the colors of the Royal Guard. "The king asks if the provision inventory is complete," he said very formally. "Tell the king it will be complete by midday," I said, "and tell him the salt storage was improperly managed and that I've corrected it, which may affect the estimated supply timeline." The young guard blinked, as though the precise, practical nature of my response was not what he had expected. Then he nodded and left. He returned an hour later. "The king acknowledges your report." I nodded and kept working. His name, I learned later, was Finn. He was the youngest of the king's personal guard, assigned to liaison duties partly because of his approachable manner, and partly, I suspected, because the more senior guards found it beneath them. He became a fixture at the edge of my working hours, appearing with questions, relaying information, occasionally lingering to watch me work with the quiet curiosity of someone who found efficiency interesting. On the second day, he told me, entirely without prompting, that the pups were doing well. "All three?" I asked, not looking up from my inventory. "All three. The small one, the tawny one. The king has been sitting with it himself in the evenings." I stopped writing. "The king sits with it himself," I repeated. "Every evening since you brought them in." Finn seemed to understand that he had said something significant, because he added quickly, "I don't think I was meant to mention that." "Then perhaps don't mention it again," I said, and went back to my work. But I thought about it. I thought about it more than I intended to. On the third day, I met the others. The king's inner household, the people who traveled with him, who managed his daily life in the field, were a specific kind of people. Not courtiers. Courtiers stayed in the palace at Vornholt. These were working people of high skill. Aldous the steward, Marin the head cook, a woman of 50 with forearms like a blacksmith and a precision with spices that was almost aggressive. There was Cato, the head of the Royal Guard, a quiet man of middle age who spoke rarely and watched everything. There was Petra, who managed the king's correspondence and had the particular intensity of someone who treats information as currency. And there was Sable. Sable was the king's advisor. She was perhaps 40, silver-haired before her time, with a kind of angular face that seemed designed for skepticism. She appeared at the entrance to the provision tent on the third morning and stood watching me work for a full minute before she spoke. "You're the woman from the road," she said. "I am." "Hazel." She said my name as if testing its weight. "Aldous tells me you've reorganized the entire provision system in 2 days. It needed reorganizing. Most people who come into this camp spend their first week trying to understand the hierarchy," she said. "You spent yours counting salt." "Salt keeps people alive through winter," I said. "Hierarchy doesn't." A pause. Then something that might, in another woman, have been the beginning of a smile. On Sable's face it was more subtle, a slight softening at the edges. "He wants to speak with you this evening," she said, "after the meal service." She left without explaining who he was, as though the word could only mean one thing in this camp, which, I supposed, it could. I spent the rest of the day managing the evening meal preparation with Marin, who tested me with the particular energy of a woman who did not share her domain easily. She assigned me the most tedious tasks first, grinding spices, sorting lentils, counting bread portions, and watched to see how I responded. I responded by doing them well and without complaint, because these were tasks I had done 100 times, and they held no injury to my dignity. By the end of the preparation, Marin had begun explaining things to me rather than commanding them. It was a small shift, but it was real. The meal was served. The camp ate. The fires settled into their evening rhythms, and then Finn appeared at my elbow and said quietly, "He's ready for you." The king's central tent was larger than it appeared from outside, divided into sections by heavy curtains, The front section served as a kind of working room. A large table covered in maps, 2 chairs, a brazier burning steadily. He was standing at the map table when I entered, studying something with his back partially to the entrance. He turned when I came in. He looked tired. Not weakly tired. Not the tired of someone who was overindulged or slept poorly from comfort. The tired of someone carrying something heavy for a long time without setting it down. "Hazel," he said. "My lord." He gestured to the chair across the table. An unusual courtesy, I thought, to offer a servant a seat. I sat, because refusing would have been its own kind of statement. He remained standing for a moment, then seemed to make a decision, and sat across from me. "The pups are stronger," he said first. "I'm glad to hear it." "The small one, the tawny one." He paused briefly. "She has decided that anyone who approaches too quickly is an enemy. She bit Cato this morning." "She was frightened in the cold for a long time," I said. "She'll need patience." He looked at me. "You speak of her as though you know her." "I carried her for 4 hours. You learn something about a creature in that time." The amber eyes held mine for a moment. In the firelight, they were more complex than they had seemed in the steward's tent. Not simply assessing, but layered. Something lived behind that gaze that he kept carefully managed. "You have children," he said. "2, a boy and a girl. And their father has been gone 14 months. He was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry." The words were simple, and he said them simply, without the elaborate performance of sympathy that some people offered, which always felt like it was more about their own comfort than mine. His condolence had the weight of someone who understood loss specifically, not generally. "What I said to you in the steward's tent," he said then directly, as though he had been waiting to return to it. "I want to explain. My lord does not owe me an explanation." "No," he agreed. "But I am giving you one regardless." He set his hands flat on the table, a deliberate gesture that felt like the beginning of honesty. "The 3 pups you found are not simply animals to me. The female who whelped them. She was bred from my father's last line. She was the last of it. Her pups are—" He stopped briefly. "They matter to me considerably. The fact that you found them. That you chose to carry them, rather than continue on your own errand. That you walked 4 hours in the cold to bring them here." He looked at me steadily. "That is not a small thing." "I could not have left them," I said. "Most people could have," he said quietly. "Most people did, in fact. My men passed that road in the night and did not stop." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. "I mean what I said," he continued. "I do not make that kind of declaration carelessly. But I also understand that you are a person, not a transaction, and that you deserve the space to—" A brief pause, the faintest crack in the careful composure, "to make your own decision about it." The fire crackled between us. "My children," I said, "would be provided for, completely, permanently." "They are part of any answer I give," I said. "They are not a condition I will soften or set aside." "I know," he said. And the way he said it, quiet, without surprise, without the faint condescension that some men would have allowed themselves, made something shift in my chest. "I need time," I said. He nodded once. "You have it." I stood. He stood as well. Another small courtesy that I noted without knowing yet what to do with. At the curtain, I paused and turned back. "The tawny pup," I said. "She needs to be approached from the side, not head-on. It will make her less afraid." He looked at me. Something in the tired, layered face became briefly less guarded. "Thank you, Hazel," he said. I nodded and left the tent, walking back through the cold camp with my heart doing something I had not felt in 14 months. Something that felt dangerously like the first. Fragile loosening of a long-held knot. 3 weeks passed. They passed in the particular way that time passes when you are working hard and thinking harder. Quickly on the surface, slowly underneath. Each day full enough to occupy the hands, while the mind runs its own separate current beneath everything. My days had a shape now. Before the light, fires checked and stoked throughout the inner camp. The provision tents unlocked. The morning grain measured and sent to Marin's kitchen. Mid-morning. Inventory, correspondence with Aldous about supply levels, coordination with the 2 junior helpers assigned to me. A quiet girl named Bess, and an older man called Wart, who had a bad knee but an encyclopedic knowledge of how long things kept in cold storage. Afternoon, the preparation support for the evening meal, the linen check, the small emergencies that arrived without announcement in any living camp. Evening, the accounts, the next day's list, and then, if I was honest, a few minutes outside the provision tent, looking at the stars above the Thornfield clearing, and thinking about things I had not yet decided. I sent word to old Marta in Ashenvale at the end of the first week, through a royal messenger, a luxury I was still not accustomed to, with enough silver coin for 2 months of the children's keeping, and a letter for Pip that I dictated carefully, choosing words he could understand. Mama is working. Mama is warm. Take care of your sister. I will send for you soon. The messenger returned 3 days later with a folded scrap of parchment. Pip could not write, but Marta could, and she had written on his behalf. Rosie says the wool rabbit misses you. Pip says he is brave. I say, come home when you can. They are well. I read it twice, and folded it very small and put it in the pocket of my apron, and I did not think about it again until night when it was safe to think about it. The camp had its own social order, as all enclosed communities do, and I had learned it the way I learned everything, by watching carefully before speaking. Cato, the head of the guard, was the authority of the outer camp. Aldous ran the inner administration with quiet precision. Marin commanded the kitchen with an authority no one questioned. Sable moved through all of it like weather, present everywhere, attached to nothing, reporting only to the king. And Dominic himself. I had begun to think of him by name, privately, though I called him my lord to his face, moved through the camp with a kind of contained energy that I had not initially understood but was beginning to. He was not remote. He was not the cold, untouchable figure that legend made of Alpha Kings. He spoke to his guards by name. He knew which horses had developed shoes problems and asked Cato about them directly. He appeared sometimes in the kitchen doorway in the early morning, not to inspect but simply to check. On Marin, on the supplies, on the quiet pulse of the camp's welfare. Once, early in the second week, I turned from the bread shelves to find him standing in the provision tent entrance, looking at my reorganized inventory wall. The series of knotted cord records I used to track quantities at a glance, a system I had developed over years of managing a household on insufficient resources. "What is this?" he said. "A counting system," I said. "Each knot represents a unit. The color of the cord is the category. I can read the whole store in less than a minute." He studied it for a moment. "Aldous uses parchment lists. Parchment lists require literacy to read quickly and can't be updated without rewriting," I said. "This can be changed in seconds." He looked at the cord wall, then at me, with an expression I had come to recognize over the weeks, a particular quality of attention that meant he was filing something away. "Teach Aldous the system," he said. "Yes, my lord." He left. But at the entrance he paused, his back still partially turned, and said, "The tawny pup's name is Ember. She bit Finn this morning." There was something in his voice that was not quite amusement, but lived in the same vicinity. "Your advice about the side approach seems to work for everyone but Finn." "Finn approaches everything at full speed," I said. "He should slow down." A brief pause. "I'll tell him you said so." He left. I stood for a moment looking at the empty entrance, then turned back to my work. The other members of the inner household had made their various assessments of me by the second week, and settled into their positions relative to mine. Marin had accepted me as an equal in the provisioning sphere and a subordinate in the kitchen, which was fair. Aldous treated me with the careful respect of someone who has been surprised by competence and is adjusting. Finn had decided I was interesting, and treated me accordingly, with a kind of younger sibling energy that I found unexpectedly warming. Cato nodded to me in the mornings, which I had learned was his version of warmth. Sable was more complex. She appeared at irregular intervals, always with the quality of someone who has arrived precisely when they intended to, and she asked questions. Not hostile questions, careful ones. About my background, my husband, my children, my time in Ashenvale, about how I thought about problems, about what I had done before Cedric died, and what I had done after. On the 15th day, she asked, "When he spoke to you in the steward's tent, his declaration, were you frightened?" We were sitting in her small tent, which was organized with the same precise economy as her mind. She had offered me tea, actual tea, dried herbs steeped in hot water, something I had not had in months. I was surprised. I said carefully, "That is not the same thing." "No," I agreed. I was not frightened of him. I was frightened of the size of it, what it would mean, what it would change. Sable looked at me. And now, after 3 weeks in this camp, knowing more of what it would mean and what it would change? I wrapped both hands around the warm cup. Now I am frightened for a different reason. Which is, I looked at her directly, that I might want it. Sable was quiet for a moment. Then, "He has not been the same since his father died. 2 years ago. The pack needed a king and he became one. And somewhere in that process..." She paused, choosing words with care. "Something in him went quiet. He functions. He rules well. His people are protected, and the kingdom is stable." Another pause. "But he is a man who has been carrying winter inside him for 2 years, and I have not seen it ease until..." She stopped. "Until what?" I asked. She looked at me steadily. "Until 3 weeks ago." I did not know what to do with that, so I drank my tea and said nothing. But that evening, when Finn came to tell me, the king asked if I would join him to check on the pups. A strange, informal request that was clearly not a command. I said yes, and I followed Finn through the camp to the small warm tent where the 3 pups were kept. Dominic was already there, sitting on a low stool beside the nest of blankets where the pups slept. Ember was awake, batting at a piece of cord with more energy than she had shown the day I found her. The other 2, a gray male I had heard called Stone, and a smaller female the attendants called Pearl, were sprawled in the boneless way of young animals utterly at ease. He looked up when I entered. In the informal light of the pup tent, without the weight of the map table or the formality of the central quarters, he looked different. Not younger exactly, but less armored. "She stole the cord from Finn's bootlace," he said, nodding at Ember. "Finn should tie them tighter." That is essentially what I told him. He reached down, and Ember batted at his hand instead, transferring her attention with complete self-assurance. "She's going to be trouble." "All the best ones are," I said, and crouched on the other side of the nest. We sat like that for a while, across from each other, the pups between us, the silence comfortable in a way that silences between 2 people are not always comfortable, that must be built slowly out of accumulated small moments rather than declared. "Tell me about Ashenvale," he said. So I did. I told him about the village green and the tannery smell that came on west winds, and old Marta who kept bees in summer, and the way the miller's scales were never quite accurate, and the way the children sang a particular song at winter festival that I had always loved. I told him about Cedric without making it tragic, the simple facts of a life that had been decent and was now over, described by someone who had made her peace with the shape of it. He listened. He did not offer sympathy or redirection. He simply listened. The way someone listens when they are genuinely interested in what you are saying rather than waiting for their turn. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, I grew up in the palace at Vornholt. 40 rooms I was not allowed to enter before I was 12. A training yard where I spent more time than anywhere else. Advisors who spoke to me in complete sentences before I could speak them myself. A pause. It was not cruel, but it was particular. Lonely? I said. He looked at me. Yes. Ember had fallen asleep against his hand. Pearl had climbed partially into his lap, and he had settled one large hand over her without appearing to notice he had done it. Your children, he said. What are their names? Pip and Rosie. How old? Pip is 6, Rosie is 4. Something in his face shifted, not into softness exactly, but into something adjacent to it. Will you send for them? I looked at him across the sleeping pups. That depends on certain things, I said carefully. On whether you've made a decision, he said. On whether I understand what the decision means. Fully. He held my gaze with a particular steadiness that I had come to understand was not stubbornness but honesty. His way of saying I am not going to look away from this. It means, he said slowly, that you would be under my protection. Formally. Permanently. That your children would bear that protection as well. That you would want for nothing that is within my power to provide. He paused. It also means. A brief hesitation, the first I had seen in him. That I am asking for more than a household arrangement. I want to be honest about that. I know, I said. I have not. He stopped. Started again. I am not practiced at this. I was supposed to make a formal match 2 years ago. There were arrangements. After my father died, I let them lapse, and no one pushed me. And time... He looked down at Pearl in his lap. Time does what it does. You're telling me you're uncertain, I said. He looked up. I am telling you I am certain about this. I am uncertain about everything else. A pause. That may not be reassuring. It is, actually, I said quietly. Because it was. Because a man who declared absolute certainty about a woman he had known 3 weeks would have frightened me. A man who told the truth about where his certainty began and where it dissolved into the same confusion the rest of us lived in. That was something I could stand next to. I reached across the pups and let my hand rest briefly on the edge of the nest, near his. Send for my children, I said. Let me see this place through their eyes, and then I will give you my answer. He looked at my hand, then at my face. Something in the long-held winter of his expression shifted. Not dramatically, not in the sweeping way of stories, just slightly, just enough. Done, he said. Pip arrived first. He came into the Thornfield camp 3 days later, perched on the front of the supply cart that Dominic had sent to Ashenvale, wrapped in the extra wool blanket old Marta had apparently insisted on despite his protests. He was sitting very straight, with the particular dignity of a 6-year-old boy who has decided that this is an adventure, and that adventures require composure. Rosie was tucked against his side, asleep, clutching the wool rabbit with both arms. I was waiting at the camp entrance when the cart came through. Pip saw me, and the composure lasted approximately 3 more seconds before he scrambled down from the cart while it was still moving, making Finn, who was escorting them, lunge forward with a noise of alarm, and ran across the packed snow toward me. I caught him and lifted him and held him so tightly that he made a small sound of protest and then held on just as tightly back. Marta said you were working for a king, he said into my shoulder, muffled. I am. A real one. A real one. He pulled back and looked at me with Cedric's eyes, assessing. Is he frightening? I thought about Dominic sitting on a low stool with a sleeping pup in his lap, telling me in careful, honest words that he was certain about this and uncertain about everything else. No, I said. He is not frightening. Rosie woke when I lifted her from the cart and immediately demanded to know where the rabbits were. When I told her there were wolf pups instead, she looked at me with the full gravity of a 4-year-old making an important judgment and said that wolves were acceptable. I brought them to the tent assigned to us, larger now, since Aldous had quietly moved me to a private space when the king's messenger had gone to Ashenvale, and settled them, fed them from the kitchen stores that Marin had sent over without being asked, and watched them explore their new surroundings with the adaptable energy of small children, for whom the world is still primarily interesting rather than threatening. That evening, Dominic came to the provision tent while I was closing the day's accounts. He did not announce himself. He appeared in the entrance the way he sometimes did, and waited. "They arrived safely," I said, without looking up from the cord records. "I know. Finn told me the boy nearly fell from the cart." A pause. He said the boy seemed entirely unconcerned about it. "Pip has no fear of heights," I said. "It's one of several things I've been unable to address." "A useful quality," Dominic said, "in certain futures." I looked up at that. He was leaning against the tent post with his arms crossed, and there was something in his expression, careful, watchful, but underneath it something warm that he was not trying very hard to conceal. "You're looking at me differently," I said. "You're looking at me differently as well," he said. I considered denying it and decided not to bother. "My children are here," I said. "That changes the arithmetic." "How so?" "Before, the decision was only about me, what I wanted, what I was willing to risk." I set down the cord record. "Now I can see it through their eyes as well. And I can see—" I stopped briefly. "I can see that this is real, that this camp is real, that you are—" Another pause. "Real. Not a story. Not an arrangement. A person." He was very still. "And my answer," I said, "is yes." The word sat in the air between us, simple and enormous. He uncrossed his arms. He crossed the tent in a few steps and stopped on the other side of the work table, close enough that I had to look up to meet his eyes. This near, in the firelight, I could see things I had not seen from across a tent or across a nest of sleeping pups. The lines at the corners of his eyes that came from years of hard weather. The precise shade of amber that shifted toward dark gold in the low light. The way the careful control of his expression had eased, just slightly, just enough. "Hazel," he said. Just my name. But the way he said it was different from every other time. Not a label, not a summons. Something else entirely. "Yes," I said again, quieter this time. He reached across the table and took my hand. His was warm and large and careful, and he held mine the way you hold something you intend to keep. The formal claiming ceremony happened 10 days later, when Dominic sent word to the nearest noble seat, and the appropriate witnesses could be assembled. In that 10 days, the camp shifted around the fact of what had been decided with the particular efficiency of people who serve a king and are accustomed to adjusting to his reality. Aldous reorganized the tent assignments with no visible reaction. Cato met my eyes in the morning with a nod that was fractionally deeper than before. Marin sent an extra portion of the spiced apple preserve to our tent without explanation. Sable came to find me the morning after, and sat in the provision tent, and said nothing for a long moment before saying, "Good," with the finality of someone closing an account. Finn told everyone. The children adapted with a speed that either said everything about their resilience or everything about the quality of the place they had landed in. Pip found Finn within the first day, and attached himself like a small, determined shadow, following the young guard through his duties with approximately 10,000 questions that Finn answered with admirable patience. Rosie discovered the pup tent on the second day. It was Dominic who told me about it, in the same not quite amused tone he had used about Ember and the bootlace. "Your daughter," he said, "has been sitting in the pup tent for 2 hours. No one can get her to leave." "Did anyone try very hard?" I asked. A pause. "Not especially, no. She has them all arranged in her lap, and is telling them a story about a rabbit. I thought about going to retrieve her and decided against it. Ember? In her lap with the others. Apparently the rabbit story is very compelling. I looked at him. He was trying not to smile, which meant the smile was visible anyway, contained but real, reaching the amber eyes in a way that changed his whole face into something that was simply a person, unguarded, finding something genuinely delightful. I decided then that this was my favorite version of him. The ceremony itself was small. In the tradition of the Alpha Kingdom, a formal claiming required the presence of a ranking noble as witness, an elder of the relevant community, and a spoken declaration before both. Dominic had arranged for the lord of the nearest noble house, a bearded man called Renwick, who arrived with considerable curiosity and minimal ceremony, and asked Aldous, as the elder of the traveling household, to serve in the second role. We stood in the central tent, with the maps pushed aside and the braziers burning warmly, and the witnesses present, and Finn hovering near the entrance with an expression of barely suppressed emotion that he kept attempting to rearrange into professionalism. Dominic spoke the declaration first, as was the tradition. The claimer spoke before the claimed, accepting responsibility before receiving it. He spoke clearly and without hesitation, looking at me the entire time, and the words he chose were older than ceremony, older than court language, the plain words of the tradition that meant, "I see you. I choose you. I will not put this down." Then it was my turn. I had practiced what I wanted to say. I had lain awake going over it. I had revised it and revised it again until it was precise and clean and said exactly what I meant. What came out instead was simpler than any of that. I walked 4 hours in the cold because I couldn't leave something small and frightened alone in a ditch. I said, I didn't know then what it would lead to. I wouldn't have believed it if someone had told me. I looked at him. I know now. And I choose it. I choose this. I choose you. Renwick declared it witnessed. Aldous declared it witnessed. Finn made a sound near the entrance that he immediately converted into a cough. Winter broke 6 weeks later. The Thornfield camp began its dismantling in stages. The outer tents first, then the supply structures, then the great canvas walls of the inner ring, folded and packed with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before. The clearing that had been a small city of warmth and order gradually returned to itself. Open ground, old trees, snow giving way at the edges to the first suggestion of mud and new grass underneath. We rode back to Vornholt when the road was passable. I had never been to the capital. I rode beside Dominic, with Pip in front of Finn on his horse, an arrangement Pip had negotiated with a directness that had briefly startled the young guard and then completely charmed him, and Rosie in front of me, asleep against my arm, before we had cleared the first ridge. I had imagined Vornholt as something imposing, all stone walls and cold authority. What I found was larger than I had imagined, and more alive. A city built around a palace that was itself built around a long history. Its stones worn smooth in the places where generations of hands had touched them. Its great hall smelling of wood smoke and old timber, and the particular warmth of a place that had been inhabited and cared for over a very long time. The people who came out to watch the king return looked at me with curiosity that I met steadily, because I had learned in 14 months as a widow that the steadiest thing you can do when people are assessing your right to exist in a space is simply to exist in it, without apology and without aggression, and let the fact of your presence make its own argument. The palace household received me with the careful efficiency of people who serve an institution rather than a person, professional, thorough, and entirely willing to recalibrate. The head of the household staff, a woman named Dressa, who had managed the palace interior for 20 years, gave me a tour of the domestic operations with the air of someone deciding how much authority to extend before seeing what I did with it. By the end of the first week, she had given me more than she had planned. The children settled into the palace with a speed that alternately amazed and humbled me. Pip found the training yard within 2 days and stood at its fence watching the guards practice with an intensity that Cato apparently noticed and brought to Dominic, who brought to me with a question in his eyes. "He's 6, I said. He could begin observation. Nothing more. I thought about it for exactly the time it took me to picture Pip's face if I said yes. "All right," I said. "Observation only." Dominic nodded, and there was something in the simple way we had just made a decision together. Practical, considered, mutual. That felt more real than any ceremony. Rosie, for her part, asked on the 4th day whether the pups were coming to the palace. When told yes, they would be transported carefully when they were old enough for the journey. She accepted this with a gravity that suggested she was filing it as a matter to be checked on regularly. Months passed. The pups came to the palace in early spring, old enough to travel, opinionated enough to make the trip memorable according to Finn, who accompanied them and arrived looking like a man who had survived something. Ember immediately claimed the hearthrug in the main hall as her territory and defended it against all comers with the serene self-assurance of someone who has decided they belong somewhere completely. Dominic and I built a life the way all lives are actually built, not in grand gestures, but in the accumulated weight of ordinary things. Morning councils where I sometimes sat at the edge of the room and sometimes was asked directly for my read on a provisioning matter or a household concern. Evenings by the fire where he read correspondence and I worked on the palace inventory systems that Dressa had, with admirable pragmatism, allowed me to reorganize entirely. Conversations that sometimes lasted deep into the night, and sometimes were just the comfortable silence of two people in the same room, not needing to fill it. He told me, one evening near midsummer, about his father. Not the official version, the great king, the steady ruler, the real version. The man who had been distant in the particular way of men who love their children but do not know how to show it except through instruction. Who had died before Dominic had managed to close the distance between them. I listened the way he had listened to me in the pup tent, the first night, without redirecting, without softening what he was saying, just receiving it. When he finished, I said, "You are not him." He was quiet. "I have seen you with my children," I said. "I have seen you with Finn, with Cato, with every person in that camp who needed something from you. You are not a distant man, Dominic. You became one for a while because grief does that. But you are not one." He looked at me for a long moment with the amber eyes that I knew now better than I knew most things in the world. Their moods, their quality of attention, the particular way they shifted when something had reached him. "You say things," he said quietly, "that I did not know I needed to hear." "Someone should," I said. "You are surrounded by people who tell you what is true about the kingdom. Someone should tell you what is true about you." He reached over and took my hand, in the way he had taken it in the provision tent. Careful, deliberate, a choice rather than a reflex. "Stay," he said, though we both knew it was not a question anymore. "I am already staying," I said, and I was. The woman who had walked out of Ashenvale in worn boots with a cloth sack, and 4 days of grain and no clear plan except survival. She was still inside me. She had not disappeared, had not been replaced by something softer or more elevated or less acquainted with the arithmetic of difficult winters. She was simply also this, a woman who had carried warmth toward frightened things and found, on the other side of that long, cold walk, that warmth had a way of returning to its source. Pip began formal observation at the training yard that autumn. He was serious about it in the way he was serious about most things, taking it with both hands, asking Cato questions that made the quiet man blink and then answer with increasing respect. Rosie named all 3 pups twice over, decided their first names were wrong, and assigned them new ones that she considered definitive. Ember kept the hearthrug. Dominic ruled, and I helped him in the ways I could. Not from a throne, not as a warrior, but as the person who understood that a kingdom is a household writ large, and that households run on the same things they always have: warmth, honesty, the willingness to count what you have and make it enough, and the refusal to leave frightened things alone in the cold. Sable told me, in the palace garden one spring morning, that she had never seen him laugh until the winter at Thornfield. I told her I thought that was probably enough reason for most things. She agreed, which from Sable was the same as a declaration. The winters that followed were cold, as winters in Vornholt always were. But they were not the same kind of cold. They did not enter without permission. They did not find us unprepared, and the small tawny pup I had carried against my heart through 4 hours of frozen road, Ember, who bit Finn and stole bootlaces and guarded the hearthrug with absolute conviction, lay by the fire every evening of her long life and lifted her head each time I walked into the room, as if reminding me, in the way animals sometimes do, of the precise moment everything changed. I always stopped to acknowledge her. It seemed like the least I could do,